The myth of the unintelligent president. When we look back at the history of the American presidency, it is incredibly tempting to fall into the trap of modern political theatre. We watch debates, we read headlines, we listen to sound bites, and we inevitably categorize our commanders-in-chief onto a simple binary scale of smart and stupid. It is a favourite pastime of the American electorate to accuse the opposition's leader of being not just wrong, but cognitively deficient. But when we step away from the noise of partisan politics and look at the cold, hard historiometric data, a completely different reality emerges. The men who have occupied the Oval Office are not a cross-section of the average American public. They are, almost without exception, a cohort of profound cognitive precocity. To understand the intelligence of American presidents, we have to throw away the idea of an average mind. We are not looking at a scale that ranges from dull to brilliant. We are looking at a distribution of the elite. We are comparing different flavors of extraordinary. To truly grasp this, we have to look at the bottom of the distribution first. It is a common misconception in popular discourse that low-ranked presidents were unintelligent in an absolute sense. For decades, one name has frequently sat near the bottom of historical IQ estimates: Ulysses S. Grant. The historiometric estimate places Grant's IQ at 130. To the untrained eye, seeing a president at the bottom of a ranking might suggest a lack of intellectual firepower. But let us put that number into perspective. An IQ of 130 is 3 standard deviations above the national average. It places an individual in the top 2.2% of the entire human population. The man holding the lowest estimated IQ in the presidential cohort was still smarter than 98 out of every 100 people he ever met. So why was Grant's intellect so historically maligned? The answer lies in the limitations of historiometry itself, a science that is entirely dependent on the biases of biographical accounts. For generations, Grant was burdened by the butcher myth. He was characterized as a dullard, a man whose military victories during the Civil War were the result of brute force, numerical superiority, and an alleged fondness for whiskey, rather than any sort of strategic genius. But modern historical reassessments have completely dismantled this narrative. Military historians now look at Grant's Vicksburg campaign as a masterclass in logistics, maneuver warfare, and strategic brilliance. Furthermore, while he was dying of throat cancer, Grant authored his personal memoirs to secure his family's financial future. Those memoirs were published by Mark Twain and are still widely considered to be among the greatest works of nonfiction ever written by an American public figure. They reveal a man of profound emotional and strategic intelligence. Grant's historically low score is largely an artifact of his pre-presidential career. Before the Civil War, he struggled immensely in business and was widely perceived as a failure. Society equated his lack of a head for business with a cognitive deficiency. In reality, it was likely a combination of a total lack of interest in commerce and an unfortunate tendency to trust untrustworthy associates. Grant's story is a vital caveat when studying historical intelligence. The data is only as good as the history books it is drawn from, and history is rarely objective. The pinnacle of raw processing. Power if Ulysses S. Grant represents the misunderstood baseline of presidential intelligence. John Quincy Adams represents the absolute ceiling of raw, unadulterated processing power. When researchers analyze the upper quartile of the presidential IQ distribution, they find a group of individuals whose intellectual trajectories were locked in long before they ever thought about running for office. But John Quincy Adams stands alone. He is the singular most intelligent president in the historiometric record. His estimated IQ reaches an astonishing 170. That score is more than 4 standard deviations above the population mean. It places him in the top 1/100th of 1% of all human beings. If you look at the biography of John Quincy Adams, it reads less like a childhood and more like a rigorous, decades-long training program for global leadership. Born in 1767, the son of the second president, he was quite literally bred for the world stage. His education spanned 2 continents and several languages. By the time he was 10 years old, he was crossing the treacherous Atlantic Ocean to travel with his father on critical diplomatic missions to France. By the age of 14, an age where most modern adolescents are entering high school, John Quincy Adams was serving as the private secretary and official French translator for Francis Dana, the United States minister to Russia. He possessed an uncanny ability to navigate the complex, treacherous royal courts of Europe. He maintained detailed, highly sophisticated diaries from his early youth, providing historians with clear, undeniable evidence of his staggering cognitive precocity. He was a master of formal logic, a savant of linguistics, and a human encyclopedia. And yet his presidency is largely remembered as a failure. He served only one term. He was utterly paralyzed by a hostile Congress. He refused to engage in the patronage and political horse trading that gets legislation passed. This brings us to a fascinating paradox in the study of leadership. While Adams possessed the highest raw IQ ever recorded in the Oval Office, his intellectual brilliance score, a metric used by researchers to measure creativity, vision, and adaptability, was significantly lower than that of his peers. He had the processing speed of a supercomputer, but he lacked the creative spark, the empathy, and the flexibility that characterizes the highest-ranked leaders in history. The distinction of brilliance. This brings us to Thomas Jefferson. If John Quincy Adams had the highest raw intelligence, Thomas Jefferson represents the absolute pinnacle of intellectual brilliance. Jefferson's estimated IQ sits at an incredibly high 160, but his brilliance score breaks the scale at 3.1, the highest in presidential history. Jefferson perfectly illustrates the difference between sheer processing power and what psychologists call polymathic diversity. His intelligence was not just about doing math in his head or translating dead languages, though he could do both. It was about an insatiable, almost obsessive curiosity about the physical and philosophical world. He was not just a politician. He was an architect who designed his iconic home at Monticello and the University of Virginia. He was an inventor. He was a horticulturalist who experimented with crop rotations. He was a political philosopher whose words forged the foundation of a new nation. He even edited his own version of the Bible. Psychologists note that Jefferson possessed a massive loading of a personality trait known as openness to experience. His mind was a sponge, perpetually seeking out new information, testing boundaries, and finding ways to integrate completely disparate fields of knowledge into a cohesive worldview. The contrast between Adams and Jefferson yields perhaps the most critical insight into the nature of leadership intelligence. Historians generally rank Jefferson in the top tier of presidential greatness. John Quincy Adams, despite his 175 IQ, is often relegated to the middle or lower middle tiers. The data suggests something profound. While a very high IQ is undoubtedly an asset, the capacity for brilliance, which is defined by curiosity, idealism, complexity, and vision, is a far more reliable predictor of a president's ultimate historical legacy. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy hosted a dinner for 49 Nobel laureates at the White House. Looking out at the room, Kennedy famously remarked, "I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge, that has ever been gathered together at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." That is the essence of intellectual brilliance, the Goldilocks zone of leadership. But what happens when a leader is simply too smart for their own good? This brings us to one of the most fascinating psychological concepts in the study of political science, the 1.2 standard deviation theory. The core objective of studying presidential intelligence is to figure out if being smarter actually makes you a better president. When researchers ran a meta-analysis of presidential performance, they did find a positive correlation between IQ and perceived success. But here is the catch. The relationship is not perfectly linear. It is not a straight line where more IQ points automatically equal more success. Instead, it looks like an inverted U-curve. There is a sweet spot, and there is a point of diminishing returns. The theory suggests that the optimal IQ for a leader is approximately 1.2 standard deviations above the mean of the group they are leading. In simpler terms, you want a leader who is smarter than the average citizen, but not so vastly intelligent that they become completely alien to the people they serve. If a leader is too intelligent, they often struggle to communicate effectively. Their vocabulary becomes too dense. Their policies become too theoretical and complex. They begin to skip steps in their logic because the answer is obvious to them, leaving their followers confused and alienated. The public begins to view them as elitist, arrogant, or dangerously out of touch with the reality of everyday life. We saw this with John Quincy Adams, who could converse with Russian czars but could not hold a relatable conversation with an American farmer. We saw glimpses of it with Jimmy Carter, a brilliant nuclear engineer with a phenomenal memory who often got so bogged down in the micro details of policy that he struggled to communicate a broad, inspiring vision to the country. This theory perfectly frames the modern era, particularly the presidency of George W. Bush. George W. Bush occupies the lower end of the modern intelligence distribution. In the early 2000s, a massive internet hoax circulated, claiming Bush had an IQ of 91, making him essentially average or slightly below average. The hoax was widely believed because it fit the media narrative of the time. But the historiometric reality is entirely different. George W. Bush's actual estimated IQ is 138.5. Let's remember, his SAT scores and his Harvard MBA placed him solidly in the upper 10% of the intelligence distribution. He is, by any clinical definition, highly intelligent. But relative to the incredibly elite cohort of men who have held the presidency, his intellect appeared below average. Under the lens of the 1.2 standard deviation theory, Bush's comparative IQ was actually his greatest political superpower. His intelligence sat perfectly in that Goldilocks zone. He was smart enough to manage the staggering complexities of the executive branch, but he was not so disconnected from the baseline that he couldn't speak the language of the people. His lower comparative IQ and his deliberate folksy Texas drawl communication style was a massive asset in public persuasion. It allowed him to connect with voters on a visceral, emotional level. People famously said he was the candidate they would most like to have a beer with. Highly complex, deeply theoretical thinkers often cannot manufacture that kind of authenticity. The inverted U function proves that in democratic leadership, raw processing power is not the ultimate trump card. The ability to relate to the common man, to communicate clearly without condescension, and to make complex issues feel manageable is just as valuable as the ability to solve differential equations. The temperament equation. When we step back and look at the grand tapestry of presidential intelligence, we have to acknowledge the phantom variable that IQ tests cannot measure: temperament. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. famously met a young Franklin Delano Roosevelt. After the meeting, Holmes described FDR with a quote that has echoed through history: "A second-class intellect, but a first-class temperament." FDR did not have the raw computing brainpower of a John Quincy Adams or a Thomas Jefferson. He was not a philosopher king, but he had an unparalleled emotional intelligence. He had the ability to project radiant confidence during the darkest days of the Great Depression. He had the social genius to manage a room full of massive clashing egos during World War II. He intuitively understood the mood of the American people and used the radio, the new technology of his time, to speak directly into their living rooms as a reassuring friend. Similarly, Abraham Lincoln, largely self-educated and lacking the formal pedigree of his predecessors, possessed an absolute mastery of emotional regulation and political timing. He famously filled his cabinet with his fiercest political rivals, a move that requires an immense amount of self-assurance and emotional intelligence to manage. He had a profound ability to translate the incredibly complex moral and legal arguments of the Civil War into simple, devastatingly beautiful prose that the average soldier and citizen could understand. The story of the intellectual giants of the presidency is not just a list of numbers. It is a complex study of human potential. It tells us that to be the President of the United States, a baseline of extraordinary intelligence is essentially the price of admission. You must be able to absorb, process, and synthesize a volume of information that would crush an ordinary mind. But once you cross that threshold, the rules change. The man with the highest IQ does not automatically become the greatest president. The true giants of history are those who match their intellectual gifts with a deep, enduring empathy. They are the ones who possess the brilliance to see the future, the communication skills to explain it to the present, and the emotional fortitude to carry the weight of the world without breaking.